When my son-in-law declared my home was better suited for his parents and announced they were moving in the next day, he expected me to protest. I didn't. I smiled, welcomed them warmly, and handed over a simple note, one that made his confidence vanish and turned the situation in a way he never saw coming. Before I tell you everything, do me a small favor. Subscribe to this channel and tell me where you're watching from. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Now, let me take you back to how it all began. My name is Samuel Hartwell. I was 71 years old that year, retired from ministry, living in a modest ranch house on Cedar Hollow Lane in Willow Creek, Arizona. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a low fence I repainted every spring, a creaky porch swing that still held the warmth of afternoon sun. I'd lived there since 1994, long enough for the walls to absorb voices, prayers, arguments, laughter, and the quiet sound of children finally sleeping without fear. The house wasn't large, but it was full. It had been full for decades. 47 children had passed through that front door. Some arrived with trash bags instead of suitcases. Some arrived angry, silent, bruised in ways you couldn't always see. Some stayed months. Some stayed years. Every single one left knowing 2 things. They were wanted, and they were capable of becoming more than their past. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when I heard footsteps that didn't belong to Lucy Park, the 8-year-old emergency placement sleeping upstairs. Lucy padded when she walked, as if the floor might disappear beneath her. These steps were heavy, confident, entitled. Evan Caldwell didn't knock. He walked in like the house already belonged to him. He stood in the middle of my living room, hands clasped, scanning the space the way someone inspects a purchase before finalizing paperwork. His eyes paused on a worn couch, the bookshelf bowed under years of use, the family photos lining the hallway. Photos he'd walked past dozens of times without ever asking a single question. My parents are moving in tomorrow, he said. No greeting. No pause. I waited for him to smile, to say he was joking, to explain why he'd come so early on a weekday. None of that happened. The moving truck's already booked, he continued, pulling out his phone. They'll take the master bedroom. You'll be relocating to Golden Haven Residences. It's only 15 minutes away. Meals included. Activities. Everything's arranged. Relocating. He said it like a scheduling update. I set my mug down slowly, careful not to spill. Upstairs, Lucy started humming as she brushed her teeth, the soft off-key tune she always used when she was nervous but trying to be brave. Evan, I said evenly, are you asking me something? He frowned, as if the question itself confused him. I'm informing you. This house is too much for one person anyway. My parents' lease is ending, and they need space. Real family needs space. There was that word again. Real. Evan had been circling my life for 3 years. Ever since he married my daughter, Elena. From the beginning, he'd treated me like a placeholder, a temporary solution, someone who had filled a gap until something better came along. She's not really your daughter, he'd once said during a disagreement, as if stating a neutral fact. You were just there when she needed someone. Just there, as if raising a damaged 7-year-old girl for 11 years was a coincidence. Elena had been my first foster placement. She'd arrived quiet, withdrawn, flinching at sudden movement. It took a year before she called me Dad. Another year before she believed the word meant permanence. I'd watched her graduate high school, college, build a career, fall in love. I'd stood in the front row at her wedding and cried like I had every other time when my children stepped into a new life. Evan never saw that history. He saw an old man driving a faded sedan. He saw thrift store jackets and a modest pension. He saw what he wanted to see. What he didn't see were the 237 framed photographs lining the hallway. Diplomas, medical school graduations, judicial oaths, military commissions. He walked past them every visit, blind to their meaning. You don't need 3 bedrooms, Evan went on, pacing now. My parents can take over the payments, handle maintenance. It's practical. Practical, I repeated. Yes, you're 71. You don't need all the space. I thought of the upstairs bedroom where Lucy slept. Clutching a stuffed rabbit I bought her the first night, she cried herself to sleep. I thought of the foster care license tied to this address. I thought of the phone calls that came at odd hours when a child needed somewhere safe. Now, I'll think about it, I said. Evan smiled. The kind of smile people give when they believe the outcome is already decided. That's good, he said, because the timeline's tight. Announcement today. Packing Friday. Saturday you'll be settled. He'd planned my life down to the hour. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a takeover. After he left, Elena called me in tears. Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he was going to do this. I listened to her cry and thought about all the times I'd told her she mattered. All the times I'd promised she was never disposable. Don't apologize, I told her. You're not responsible for his choices. But Evan wasn't finished. 2 weeks earlier, he'd shown up with brochures, glossy images of smiling seniors in tidy rooms barely big enough for a bed and a chair. This is perfect for you, he'd said. Golden Haven, Silver Path, Serenity Oaks. You'll have friends. Supervision. What he saw as supervision, I saw as exile. This house wasn't just wood and drywall. It was a lifeline. It was still active, still serving its purpose. 3 months earlier, Lucy had arrived here because no one else could take her. If I left, she'd be uprooted again. If I gave up the house, the license would go with it. No more emergency placements. No more sanctuary. Evan saw empty rooms. I saw futures. Financially, the house was nearly paid off. $18,000 remained on a property now worth nearly $300,000. Evan's parents would be getting a lifetime asset for the cost of a few rent checks. But money wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was what his words would teach my children if I stayed silent. That love was temporary. That commitment expired. That biology outweighed devotion. I'd spent 30 years teaching the opposite. That night, after Elena left, I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one Evan had never bothered to look inside. Inside were business cards, letters, photographs, graduation announcements, wedding invitations. 47 lives. I picked up the phone. The first call was to Dr. Sofia Alvarez, pediatric surgeon at Sunrise Children's Hospital in Phoenix. She'd come to me at 13, angry and failing school. Last Christmas, she'd sent me a card with her direct number handwritten inside. Dad, she answered, voice bright. Is everything okay? Not exactly, I said. There was a pause. Then, who's causing the problem? That's when I realized Evan had made a mistake far bigger than he could imagine. And this was only the beginning. Amanda, no. Dr. Sofia Alvarez now, didn't wait for me to explain everything. Dad, she said, the warmth in her voice sharpening into something precise and controlled. Tell me exactly what he said. I told her about the moving truck, the timelines, the assumption that my life, my home, my calling could be packed into boxes and reassigned like furniture. There was silence on the line, not confusion, not doubt. The kind of silence I'd heard years ago when Sophia was a teenager absorbing something painful and deciding what to do about it. Do you want to leave your house? She finally asked. No. Then you're not going anywhere, she said flatly. I'll make a few calls. Sophia, sweetheart, you don't need to. Dad, she interrupted gently but firmly. You didn't ask whether you needed to raise me when no one else would. You just did it. Let us do the same. The line went dead. I sat there longer than I meant to, phone still in my hand, listening to Lucy upstairs dragging her backpack down the hall. She appeared at the kitchen doorway a moment later, hair still a little wild, clutching her shoes. Are you sad? She asked. I smiled at her. No, honey, just thinking. She nodded, satisfied, and went back upstairs. Children like Lucy learn to read emotions quickly. I made a note to be careful. By noon, the phone rang again. Dad, it's Nathan. Judge Nathan Cole. Once a terrified 9-year-old who hid in my closet for weeks. Now a federal judge in Alexandria, Virginia. I just got off the phone with Sophia, he said. She gave me the overview. I've already looked at the legal side. What your son-in-law is attempting has no standing. None. But legality isn't really the point here, is it? No, I said quietly. It's not. Then let's address the real issue, Nathan replied. Respect. Before I could answer, another call came in. Then another. Rebecca Stone, CEO of a technology firm I still couldn't fully understand. Dr. Liam O'Connor, calling from Portland between surgeries. Professor Elaine Morris, sounding furious in a way that made me pity anyone on the receiving end of her arguments. Detective Rafael Vega. Commander Isabel Cruz. The drawer I'd opened years ago was opening itself. By evening, my quiet house had turned into something else entirely. Not chaos, but momentum. Elena came by after work, eyes red from crying. They're already talking, she said. Evan told my parents he's handling it. He thinks you're agreeing. I exhaled slowly. He thinks a lot of things. She looked around the living room, at the photos, the familiar furniture. I don't recognize him anymore. Dad. I don't know how I married someone who could talk about you like that. I reached for her hand. People show you who they are when they believe they're in control. That night, I barely slept. Thursday morning, the first car pulled into my driveway at 2:30 p.m. A silver sedan, dusted with desert grit. Dr. Sofia Alvarez stepped out still wearing scrubs, white coat folded over her arm. She hugged me hard enough to steal my breath. Where is he? She asked immediately. At work, I imagine. Good, she said. That gives us time. Time, it turned out, was something we suddenly had plenty of. Within an hour, another car arrived. Then another, and another. Judge Nathan Cole came next, stepping out of a black sedan with quiet authority, his expression unreadable until he saw me. Then he smiled, the same smile he'd worn at 14 when he finally believed he wasn't broken. By sunset, Cedar Hollow Lane looked different. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Mrs. Donnelly across the street stood openly on her porch, hands on her hips, counting luxury vehicles like she was watching a parade. Inside, the house filled with voices I hadn't heard together in decades. They didn't talk about Evan at first. They talked about memories. The porch swing, Raphael laughed. That thing almost killed me. It didn't almost kill you, Sophia corrected. You fell asleep during Dad's lecture about responsibility. Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed Elena photos of a conference room with a bronze plaque bearing my name. Elena covered her mouth, stunned. I never told him, Rebecca said softly. I didn't think it mattered. It matters now, Nathan replied. Eventually, the conversation turned quiet, focused. So what's the plan? Sophia asked. The moving truck comes Saturday morning, I said. 9 o'clock. Nathan nodded. Then that's when the lesson happens. No shouting, no threats, no raised voices, just presence. Friday night, more arrived. Some flew in, some drove all night. Some brought children who clung to my legs, calling me Grandpa Sam like it was the most natural thing in the world. 47 children had once slept under this roof. Now they were returning as adults. Saturday morning came clear and cool. By 8:30, they were all there. Doctors, judges, officers, executives, teachers, each one standing on my front lawn. Not aggressive, not loud, just unmistakably united. When Evan's truck turned onto Cedar Hollow Lane, his confidence evaporated. He slowed, stopped, reversed, parked blocks away. He walked toward my house like someone approaching a storm he didn't understand. His parents followed, confusion written across their faces. The moving truck never made it past the corner. When Evan finally reached the edge of the lawn, Sophia stepped forward. You must be Evan, she said calmly. His mouth opened, closed. I'm Dr. Sofia Alvarez, she continued. This is my father. Nathan joined her, then Rebecca, then the rest. One by one, names and titles filled the air, not as boasts, but as facts Evan had never bothered to learn. When it was my turn, I stepped forward. Good morning, I said quietly. I believe you want to discuss my housing situation. Evan looked around, at the cars, at the people. at the neighbors filming from porches. "Cancel it," he whispered finally, voice cracking. The driver blinked. "Sir, cancel everything." Evan said louder. Something broke behind his eyes. What he didn't know, what he still couldn't see, was that this moment would follow him far longer than any moving truck ever could. And the consequences were only beginning. When Evan whispered, "Cancel everything," the word didn't land softly. It felt like a drop plate, sharp, echoing, impossible to ignore. The moving truck driver nodded, already tapping on his clipboard, grateful for an excuse to turn his rig around. The engine growled, then faded, retreating down Cedar Hollow Lane with the finality of a door closing. Evan stood there a moment longer, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting from face to face, as if hoping to wake up. Around him, 47 adults remained where they were, still, composed, present. No one cheered. No one taunted. That restraint did more damage than any shouted insult could have. His mother, Judith Caldwell, finally found her voice. "Samuel," she said, stepping forward, hands twisting in her purse. We didn't know." Her husband, Frank, nodded stiffly. "Evan told us you were alone, that you needed help, that the house was too much for you." I looked at them, really looked. They weren't villains. They were people who believed their son. People who trusted his certainty. People who were now realizing the cost of that trust. "Come inside," I said. "All of you." Evan flinched, as if expecting me to slam the door instead. But I stepped aside and gestured toward the house. The same house he'd tried to take. Inside, the living room filled again. But the air was different now, heavier, quieter. Sophia poured coffee. Rebecca ushered Judith to a chair. Nathan stood near the hallway of photographs, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the frames Evan had ignored for years. Frank cleared his throat. "Samuel, I want to apologize." I nodded. "Apologies are beginning." Evan stayed standing. "I didn't mean for it to go like this," he said weakly. Rebecca turned to him slowly. "How did you think it would go?" He opened his mouth, closed it. I thought Dad Samuel would understand, that he'd see it was practical." "Practical," Sophia repeated. "To uproot a child, to dismantle a license that saves lives, to erase 30 years of work." "I didn't know about the license," Evan muttered. "That's the problem," Nathan said evenly. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out." Silence settled again. Elena, who had been standing near the kitchen doorway, finally spoke. Her voice shook, but it held. "You never asked him what he wanted. Not once." Evan turned toward her. "I was trying to do what was best for everyone." "For who?" she asked. "You? Your parents? Or the version of family you decided was real enough?" Judith began to cry quietly. "Evan, what have you done?" That question followed him out of the house an hour later. He left without another word, his parents trailing behind him like shadows. The street slowly returned to normal, though neighbors lingered, whispering, replaying what they'd witnessed. Inside, my family stayed. They cooked together, laughed together, cried in small corners. They slept on couches and air mattresses and floors, filling the house the way it had always been filled, by people who chose to be there. That afternoon, a video appeared online. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had filmed the scene from across the street. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No spectacle. Just Evan standing small in front of truth he couldn't argue with. By nightfall, the video had thousands of views. By morning, tens of thousands. Comments poured in. "This is what family looks like. Foster parents are heroes." He thought kindness meant weakness. I didn't read many of them. I didn't need to. Monday morning, Frank Caldwell called me. "Samuel," he said heavily, "Evan's been let go." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," Frank replied quietly. He crossed the line. The church renovation contract, Grace Covenant Chapel, canceled it. Pastor Reed was firm. That contract had been Evan's pride, the project he'd bragged about for months. "And Elena?" Frank continued. "She's staying with you, isn't she?" "Yes." Another pause. "We're leaving Willow Creek," Judith said from the background. We can't stay after this." I wished them well. Truly, Evan didn't call for weeks. In that time, life rearranged itself. Elena moved back into her old room. Lucy followed her everywhere, relieved by the stability. My foster care supervisor visited, beaming when she saw the support surrounding the house. "We had 5 new applications this month," she told me. "People inspired by your story. Donations arrived for the local foster program. Letters came from strangers. Some were angry on my behalf. Others were grateful. Many simply said, 'Thank you for not giving up.' 3 months passed. Then one evening, as I was trimming the hedges, a familiar truck pulled into the driveway. Evan stepped out slowly. He looked smaller somehow. Thinner. Older. "Samuel," he said, "can we talk?" I leaned on my shears. "About what?" "About everything," he said. "About how wrong I was." I studied him for a long moment. I'd seen this look before, on teenagers who'd burned bridges they didn't know how to rebuild. "Forgiveness," I said finally, "isn't a word. It's work." He nodded, tears slipping free. "I know." We stood there in the fading light, the house glowing behind us, full of voices and movement and life. This wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning. And the quiet consequences of what Evan had tried to do were only just beginning to settle in. Evan stood there at the edge of my driveway as the sun slid behind the roofs on Cedar Hollow Lane, his shadow stretching long across the concrete. He looked like a man who had spent weeks rehearsing words and discovered none of them were strong enough. I waited. Silence, when used carefully, gives truth room to surface. "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "I just needed to say I was wrong. About family. About you." I nodded once. "Those are words, Evan. They matter only if you're willing to live them." He swallowed. "I am." Behind us, the house hummed with life. Lucy's laugh floated through an open window, bright and unguarded. Elena's voice followed, gently correcting her homework. In the kitchen, dishes clinked as someone cleaned up after dinner. It was the sound of continuity, the thing Evan had tried to interrupt without understanding what it cost. "I'm not asking for forgiveness today," he added quickly. "I know I don't deserve it." "That's a good place to start," I said. He nodded again, eyes wet, and backed away as if afraid to turn his back. When his truck pulled away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. Some storms pass only after teaching you which structures will stand. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not empty. They were full in a different way. Purposeful, steady. Elena settled into a routine that surprised her. She helped Lucy with school. She cooked dinner. She laughed more than she had in years. Sometimes I caught her staring at the family photos, her eyes lingering on faces she hadn't seen since childhood. "I forgot how many siblings I had," she said one night, smiling softly. "You never lost them," I replied. "Life just scattered you." Grace Covenant Chapel held a special service one Sunday morning. Pastor Reed asked me to speak, not as a pastor, but as a witness. I stood at the pulpit I'd once occupied for decades and looked out at familiar faces. Some were smiling. Some were crying. I didn't plan for my life to look the way it does, I told them. I planned to love the children put in front of me. Everything else followed. After the service, 3 couples approached me about foster care. One older man shook my hand and said, "I always thought I was too late to matter. Turns out I was wrong." Lucy's adoption process moved forward faster than anyone expected. Paperwork, interviews, home visits, all of it unfolded smoothly. When the final approval came through, Lucy held a letter like it was something fragile and magical. "So, I stay?" she asked. "You stay?" I confirmed. She launched herself into my arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Elena knelt beside us, her hands trembling as she wrapped Lucy in a hug. "Welcome home," she whispered. The video faded from public attention eventually, as all things do, but its echoes lingered. Donations continued to arrive. Volunteers signed up. The local paper ran a follow-up story about foster families stepping forward. Willow Creek changed in small but measurable ways. Evan sent a letter 6 months later. Not an email, a letter. He wrote about losing his job, about therapy, about learning how much of his identity had been built on entitlement. He didn't ask for reconciliation. He asked for guidance. I wrote back once, briefly, carefully. I told him growth begins when you stop measuring yourself against what you can take and start measuring yourself against what you can give. Winter came, then spring. On a warm April afternoon, Cedar Hollow Lane filled with cars again. Not luxury vehicles this time, but familiar ones. The children returned. Some brought spouses. Some brought children. Some brought stories of failures and restarts. They crowded the living room, spilled into the backyard, shared food and laughter. Lucy ran between them, proudly introducing herself. "I'm number 48, she announced. Sophia lifted her onto her shoulders. "Best number yet," she declared. As evening settled, we gathered on the porch. Someone asked me if I'd ever regretted keeping the house. I looked at the people spread across the yard, at the lights glowing in the windows, at the quiet street that had witnessed it all. "No," I said, "because this house was never mine alone. It was always meant to hold more than walls." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked the hallway one last time before sleep. I stopped at the wall of photographs. There was space now, just enough for one more frame. Family, I'd learned again, isn't something you defend with force. It's something you build with presence, protect with patience, and pass forward through choice. And it endures long after threats fade into memory. The months after Evan's visit settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than accidental. Nothing flashy, no dramatic turns. Just the steady work of living honestly after a fracture. Elena stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she chose to. That distinction mattered more than she realized at first. She repainted the spare room Lucy used to sleep in, soft green, the color of new leaves. She planted tomatoes in the back garden, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Slowly, almost cautiously, she began reclaiming parts of herself she'd set aside to make her marriage work. Lucy thrived in ways that startled even the social workers. Her teacher called one afternoon just to say, "She raises her hand now." All the time. She looks confident. Confidence was a fragile thing for children like Lucy. It bloomed only where safety took root. Grace Covenant Chapel changed too. Not in doctrine or tradition, but in tone. Stories like ours have a way of loosening tight assumptions. Older couples who had never considered fostering began asking questions. Younger families stopped seeing it as something other people did. The church bulletin started carrying updates, placements, needs, small victories. I kept busy but not distracted. I volunteered where I was needed. I listened more than I spoke. When you spend decades guiding others, learning to receive is its own kind of humility. Evan's absence left a noticeable gap. Not because he was missed, but because the tension he carried with him was gone. Elena noticed it first. "The house feels lighter," she said one evening. She was right. Some burdens only become obvious once they're lifted. About 9 months after that Saturday morning, Evan called again. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite, out of wisdom. When I listened later, his voice was steady but careful. He said he was continuing therapy, that he'd started volunteering at a youth shelter in Austin, that he was learning to listen without defending himself. "I'm not asking come back," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to become someone who wouldn't do what I did." I didn't return the call, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because reconciliation isn't owed on a timetable. Summer brought another family gathering, smaller this time, quieter. The children came without ceremony, blending into the house like they'd never left. Sophia brought her parents-in-law. Nathan brought case files and stories he couldn't share details of but needed to talk through anyway. Rebecca arrived late, exhausted, and fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence. That night, sitting on the porch, someone asked me a question I hadn't heard before. "Dad," Raphael said, staring out the yard, "did you ever worry it would all disappear? That one day someone would decide it didn't matter." I thought about Evan, about how close he'd come, about how easily years of work could be dismissed by someone who didn't value it. Yes, I said honestly. But I learned something important. What? That what matters doesn't vanish just because someone refuses to see it. It waits. And when it's needed, it shows up. Lucy fell asleep leaning against my arm. Elena watched her with a softness that told me she was healing too. The following fall, I received a letter from the state foster office. They wanted to use our home as a model for emergency placement training. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. They asked if I'd be willing to speak. I said yes. Standing in that room, facing people who wanted to help but were afraid of doing it wrong, I told them the truth. You don't save children, I said. You stand with them long enough for them to save themselves. Afterward, a young couple approached me. Nervous, excited, unsure. We just got our first placement, the woman said. A 9-year-old boy. We're terrified. I smiled. Good. That means you care. Winter returned quietly. Elena finalized her divorce without drama. No shouting. No public battles. Just signatures and resolve. She cried afterward, not from grief, but release. I don't hate him, she said. I just won't lose myself again. That, I knew, was the real victory. Evan sent one more letter before the year ended. Shorter, more grounded. He thanked me, not for forgiveness, but for boundaries. He said they had taught him more than kindness ever could have. I placed the letter in the drawer with the others, not as a trophy, as a marker. Life didn't return to what it was before. It became something better, truer. The house on Cedar Hollow Lane remained what it had always been, a place where people arrived unsure and left stronger. And sometimes, when the porch was quiet and the evenings stretched long, I thought about how close we'd come to losing it all. Not to force, but to assumption. That was a lesson Evan never expected to learn. And the legacy he never managed to take away. Time has a way of testing whether lessons truly take root or merely pass through like weather. The year after everything happened was when that test came. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves and new ones had to be chosen deliberately. Lucy grew taller. Not just physically, though she did shoot up fast enough that we were buying new shoes every few months. It was the way she took up space that changed. She stopped asking permission to exist. She spoke without flinching. When she laughed, she didn't glance around to see if anyone disapproved. One evening, while Elena was helping her with a science project at the kitchen table, Lucy looked up suddenly and asked, "Do you think my parents will be proud of me?" The question landed gently, but it carried weight. "I know they would," Elena said without hesitation. Lucy considered that, then nodded, as if filing it somewhere important. "I think so, too." I watched from the doorway, aware that healing rarely announces itself. It just shows up in senses like that. Elena's life began to expand again. She took a promotion she'd been postponing for years. Started running in the mornings. Reconnected with friends she'd quietly drifted away from during her marriage. She wasn't angry anymore, just clearer. "I didn't realize how small I'd made myself," she admitted once. Folding laundry. "I thought compromise meant shrinking." "Compromise means meeting," I said, "not disappearing." She smiled. Like someone hearing a truth they'd always known but never trusted. The foster system didn't slow down. Emergency calls still came at inconvenient hours. Children still arrived carrying more fear than belongings. And the house responded the way it always had, with space. One night, a teenage boy named Marcus arrived. 15, defensive, silent. He refused dinner, locked himself in his room, and stayed there until morning. I left a plate outside his door and a note with one sentence. "You don't have a talk today." The next day, the plate was empty. 2 weeks later, he asked if he could join Lucy in the backyard while she practiced throwing a baseball. Progress often looks unremarkable from the outside. Word continued to spread, not because we sought attention, but because people talk when they see something steady in a world that feels increasingly fragile. Other foster parents reached out, some to thank me, some to ask how I manage the exhaustion. "You don't," I told them. "You just decide what's worth being tired for." That spring, I was invited to speak at a statewide foster care conference. I almost declined. I'd never been comfortable with spotlights. But Sophia called and said, "Dad, you taught us to step forward when it mattered." So I went. I didn't tell the dramatic version. I told the honest one. About doubts. About nights I questioned whether I was doing enough. About the times I failed and had to apologize to a child who deserved better. Afterward, a woman in the back row approached me, tears in her eyes. "My sister aged out of the system," she said. "No one ever fought for her." I don't want that story to repeat. It doesn't always take numbers. Sometimes it just takes one person deciding to stay. Evan didn't disappear from my thoughts, though he didn't dominate them either. Growth, I'd learned, requires distance. He sent updates occasionally, never asking for praise, never justify himself. He spoke about unlearning entitlement, about discovering how much of his identity had been tied to control. One letter stood out. "I used to think strength meant getting what you want," he wrote. "Now I think it means letting go of what you're not owed." I didn't frame that letter. I didn't show it to anyone. I just folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. Some things are private victories. The following summer brought an unexpected challenge. A developer approached Elena about purchasing the house. The offer was generous. More money than either of us had ever imagined seeing at once. New zoning, expansion, promises of community development. Elena brought the paperwork to me. Conflicted. "We could do a lot of good with this," she said. "Scholarships, programs, new spaces." I read the proposal slowly. "And where would the kids go?" I asked. She exhaled. "That's the problem." We talked late into the night. About legacy. About whether mission is tied to a place or a purpose. About how easy it is to justify endings when they're wrapped in good intentions. In the end, Elena slid the papers back into the envelope. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe someday. But not while this house is still doing what it's meant to do." I felt an unexpected swell of pride. Not because she chose what I would have chosen, but because she chose deliberately. That fall, Marcus, the teenage boy who'd arrived angry and silent, brought home his first report card. All passing grades. 1B. He placed it on the counter, like he wasn't sure it deserved attention. "It's good," I said simply. He nodded. "I think I might want to be a mechanic." "Then let's figure out how," I replied. He didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed. Life, as always, continued its mix of joy and strain. There were court dates, difficult goodbyes, nights when the house felt too quiet after a child left for a permanent placement. Those were the hardest, the good endings that still felt like loss. One such night, Lucy cried herself to sleep after a friend moved on. "Why do they always leave?" she asked through tears. "Because the goal is always for them to have a place of their own," Elena said gently. Lucy sniffed. "But I don't want them to forget." "They won't," Elena promised. "Not if you matter to them." Lucy thought about that. "I think I matter." "Yes," Elena said softly. "You do." Another winter came. Slower. Calmer. The house creaked in familiar ways. The porch swing complained in the cold. Traditions held. On Christmas Eve, the doorbell rang again and again. Not because of gifts, but because people needed to be near something that felt real. Sophia flew in late, exhausted but smiling. Nathan came straight from court. Rebecca arrived with stories and questions and plans. They filled the house not as guests, but as continuations. At some point, Lucy climbed into my lap and whispered, "This is my favorite place." I held her close, knowing exactly what she meant. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked the hallway one more time. I paused at the wall of photographs. There were more now. New faces. New beginnings. Still room left. I thought back to that Tuesday morning when a man had mistaken quiet for weakness and presence for absence, when he tried to reduce a life to square footage and convenience. He had understood that some houses are built of more than wood and nails. They're built of staying. And that kind of structure doesn't collapse easily. The 7th year of Lucy's life with us began quietly, the way most meaningful chapters do. without announcements or warnings, just a gradual sense that something steady had taken root and was growing on its own terms. She had stopped counting the months since she arrived. That alone told me everything. By then, the house had learned a new rhythm. It no longer braced itself for upheaval the way it once had. It breathed. Mornings began with routine arguments over cereal choices, backpacks forgotten by the door, Elena's shoes tapping across the kitchen floor as she rushed out to work. Evenings ended with homework spread across the table, the low hum of conversation, the occasional disagreement resolved without raised voices. Normal. Hard-won, deeply earned normal. Marcus, the teenager who had arrived angry and shut down, stayed longer than expected. Court delays stretched his placement from weeks into months. At first, he acted like he was just passing through, refusing to unpack fully, keeping his duffel bag zipped as if leaving at a moment's notice. But time has a way of softening even the most guarded defenses when it's paired with consistency. One Saturday afternoon, I found him in the garage, staring at my old toolbox. "You know how you use that stuff?" he asked, skeptical. "Enough to be dangerous," I replied. He smirked. That was the first time I'd seen him do that. We spent the afternoon changing oil, his hands growing steadier with each step. He asked questions without looking at me directly, pretending the answers didn't matter as much as they did. "You ever mess up bad?" he asked suddenly. "All the time," I said. "The trick is not letting the mistake convince you it's who you are." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. By fall, he was enrolled in a vocational program. By winter, he was talking about apprenticeships. Progress didn't announce itself with trumpets. It showed up in choices made quietly when no one was watching. Elena watched all of this with a kind of reverent disbelief. "I forgot how powerful stability is," she said one evening as we cleaned up dinner. "You don't notice it until you've lived without it." She was learning, too, about boundaries, about self-trust, about how easily love can be confused with endurance. Therapy helped. Time helped more. One night, months after Evan's last letter, she asked a question she'd been holding back. "Do you think people really change?" she asked. I considered that carefully. I think some people learn. And learning changes what they're capable of choosing next. She nodded, satisfied with that distinction. Evan's name came up less often, and when it did, it no longer carried the same charge. He was part of the story, not the center of it. That mattered. Spring arrived early that year. Lucy planted sunflowers in the backyard, lining them up with serious concentration. "They'll face the sun," she explained, proud of her research. "So will you?" Elena said, brushing dirt from Lucy's hands. The foster agency called one afternoon with a difficult request. A sibling group, 2 brothers, ages 6 and 10, needed temporary placement. Short notice. High needs. Trauma layered on trauma. I didn't hesitate. That night, the house expanded again, making room the way it always had. Lucy helped set up beds, chattering nervously. Marcus stepped back instinctively, unsure of his place, until I caught his eye and nodded. "You're part of this too," I said quietly. He stayed. The younger boy cried for hours. The older one pretended not to care. Elena took the first shift. I took the second. Marcus hovered near the doorway longer than necessary. At 2 in the morning, I found him sitting on the floor outside their room. "They remind me of me," he admitted. "That's why you know what they need," I said. He nodded and stayed there until the crying stopped. Moments like that don't make headlines. They don't go viral. But they're the ones that change trajectories. That summer, the neighborhood felt different. Not because of gossip or memory of what had happened, but because something about the house had become known. Not notorious, but trusted. People waved more, dropped off casseroles when new kids arrived, asked how they could help without prying. Grace Covenant Chapel started a support group for foster families. Elena volunteered to coordinate it. Watching her stand at the front of that room, confident, composed, speaking from experience rather than obligation, I felt a quiet gratitude that no confrontation could ever produce. One evening after the meeting, a woman pulled Elena aside. "My husband thinks I'm crazy for wanting to do this," she said. "He says it'll break our hearts." Elena smiled gently. It will, but not the way you think. Loss, I learned, doesn't always mean damage. Sometimes it's proof you let something matter. Marcus eventually moved on, into a long-term placement with a mechanic who saw potential where others saw attitude. The goodbye was awkward, restrained. He didn't hug me until the last second. "Thanks," he said, voice rough, "for not giving up." "I didn't do anything special," I replied. He shook his head. "You stayed." That word followed him out the door. Lucy cried that night. Elena sat with her until the tears slowed. "Will he forget us?" Lucy asked again, echoing an old fear. "No," Elena said. "People don't forget places where they became stronger." By the end of that year, the house had welcomed and released 3 more children. Each arrival reshaped us slightly. Each departure left an echo. That was the cost. And the gift. One evening, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat on the porch swing alone. The street was quiet. The air warm. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. I thought back, not with bitterness, but clarity, to the moment Evan had stood in my living room, convinced he understood my life better than I did, convinced that silence meant consent, that humility meant surrender. He'd measured worth in square footage and convenience. He'd underestimated what happens when you invest in people instead of assets. What he never saw, what he couldn't have predicted, was that even if he'd succeeded, even if the house had been taken, the family wouldn't have disappeared. Because family isn't confined to walls. It's carried in habits, in lessons, in the quiet courage of children who learn they're allowed to take up space. The house still stood, solid and unremarkable from the outside, but inside, it continued doing what it had always done, teaching people how to stay. By the time the 8th year settled in, I'd learned something most people never do until much later in life. That stability isn't the absence of trouble. It's the presence of people who refuse to walk away when trouble arrives. Cedar Hollow Lane looked the same from the outside. Same fence, same porch swing, same faded paint that needed another coat. But inside, the house carried layers of memory that kept thickening with every passing season. Lucy was 10 by then. She had outgrown the stuffed rabbit she once clutched like a lifeline, though she still kept it tucked neatly on her bed. She joined the school choir, discovered a love for science, and developed the confidence to argue her opinions loudly and without apology. The girl who once whispered now debated. One evening, while she was sprawled across the living room floor working on a school project, she looked up suddenly and said, "Grandpa Sam, do you think people can belong in more than one place?" I didn't answer right away. "Why do you ask?" "Because my teacher says home is where you're born," she said, chewing on her pencil. "But I think that's wrong." Elena, listening from the kitchen, froze. "What do you think?" I asked Lucy. Lucy shrugged. "I think home is where someone notices when you're gone." Elena sat down beside her and hugged her so tightly Lucy protested, laughing. That night, after Lucy went to bed, Elena stayed up with me on the porch. "She's healing," Elena said softly. "But sometimes I worry about what happens when she asks questions I can't protect her from." "You don't protect children by hiding truth," I said. "You protect them by standing beside them while they learn it." Elena nodded, staring out at the quiet street. "I wish someone had done that for me sooner." "You're doing it now," I replied. "That counts." The foster calls didn't slow. If anything, they increased. Word had spread, not as gossip, but as confidence. Caseworkers knew this house could hold complicated stories. Children who'd been refused elsewhere arrived here with guarded eyes and clenched fists. They tested limits. They waited for the catch. And every time, the house answered the same way, with routine patience and refusal to panic. One boy, 12 years old, arrived convinced everyone lied eventually. He took food and hid it. Another refused to sleep in a bed. One teenage girl flinched whenever someone raised their voice, even slightly. None of these behaviors surprise me anymore. Pain teaches children prepare for loss before it arrives. What surprised them was that loss didn't come. Elena became a quiet force in the foster community. She coordinated meal rotations, organized tutoring volunteers, and started a small emergency fund for foster families facing unexpected expenses. She didn't do it loudly. She did it steadily. Watching her, I realized something that stung and healed at the same time. Sometimes people don't break under pressure. Sometimes they bend, then straighten stronger. One afternoon, almost a full year after Evan's last letter, there was a knock at the door. Not the confident knock he used to have. This one was hesitant, measured. I opened the door and found Evan standing there. He looked different again. Healthier, but humbler. Less guarded. He held a paper bag in one hand, like he didn't know what else to do with it. "I brought coffee," he said awkwardly. Lucy peeked from behind the hallway corner, eyes curious but cautious. I stepped aside. "Come in." Elena wasn't home yet. Evan glanced around the living room, at the photos, at the furniture that hadn't changed, and something like awe crossed his face. "I didn't realize how much I ignored," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You didn't." We sat. He didn't speak for a moment, then finally looked up at me. "I've been volunteering at a shelter," he said. "Teenagers. Mostly boys. They don't trust me, and I don't blame them." "What made you choose that?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because I needed to understand what I almost destroyed." Lucy edged closer, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Evan noticed her. "Hi," he said softly. She nodded. "Hi. I'm Evan," he added, like introducing himself to a stranger. "I know," Lucy said calmly. "You're the one who tried to move Grandpa Sam." Evan flinched. Lucy tilted her head. "But you look different now." "How?" Evan asked. "You're not loud," she said. "And you're not pointing." He swallowed hard. "I'm trying to be better." Lucy studied him, then shrugged. "Okay." That was it. No forgiveness speech. No judgment. Just a child deciding whether someone was safe enough to stay in the room. Elena came home an hour later. She froze when she saw Evan sitting at the table, then slowly set her bag down. "I didn't come to ask for anything," Evan said immediately. "I just want to say this in person. I was wrong. About family. About you. About him." Elena listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she nodded. "I believe you're trying," she said. "But trying doesn't erase consequences." "I know," Evan replied. "I'm not asking it to." He left after that. Quietly. No promises. No expectations. That night, Elena cried, not from grief, but from release. "I don't want to hate him anymore," she admitted. "I just don't want to live afraid of becoming small again." "You won't," I said. "You know the warning signs now." Summer stretched long and hot. Lucy went to science camp. The foster kids rotated through, some staying weeks, some months. The house remained a constant. Then came the call none of us expected. A state representative wanted to visit, not for inspection, for recognition. They'd noticed a pattern. Children placed here stabilized faster. School attendance improved. Behavioral incidents dropped. Reunifications, when possible, succeeded at higher rates. They wanted to understand why. I told them the truth. "We don't fix children," I said. "We stay long enough for them to believe they're worth fixing themselves." That fall, Grace Covenant Chapel hosted a foster appreciation night. Families filled the hall. Children ran between tables. Stories were shared, not dramatic ones, but honest ones. Lucy stood at the front and read a short paragraph she'd written for school. "Family is not who owns your house," she read clearly. "Family is who keeps the light on." The room went quiet. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of how far we'd come from that Tuesday morning, when everything was almost taken away. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house settled into silence, Elena sat beside me on the porch. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they'd succeeded?" she asked. I nodded. "Sometimes. And I think the house would have been empty," I said, "but the family would have found another way to gather." She smiled faintly. "I'm glad we didn't have to find out." So was I, because what Evan never understood, what he only began to learn much later, was that power doesn't come from control. It comes from commitment. And commitment, once given freely and consistently, has a way of standing tall long after threats fade into memory. The 9th year did not arrive with fanfare. It came the way most lasting things do, quietly, layered with routine, responsibility, and the slow confidence of a life that had survived being tested. Lucy was 11 when she stood in the doorway one morning, backpack slung over her shoulder, and announced, "I signed up for student council." Elena nearly dropped her coffee. "You did what?" Lucy grinned. "They asked who wanted to represent their class." I raised my hand. There had been a time when Lucy wouldn't even raise her eyes. That was how I measured time now. Not by calendars or anniversaries, but by moments like that, small declarations of belonging that used to feel impossible. The house on Cedar Hollow Lane continued to do what it had always done. Children arrived. Children left. Some reunified. Some moved on to permanent homes. Some stayed longer than expected. Each one added another layer to the quiet legacy Evan had once tried to dismantle without understanding it. I thought about him less often these days. Not because he'd been forgotten, but because his role in the story had shifted. He was no longer the storm. He was a reminder of what happens when someone mistakes entitlement for authority. Elena finalized a new chapter of her life that spring. She bought a small car, her first major purchase made without consulting anyone else. She laughed more freely now, made decisions without rehearsing them aloud first. Strength, I'd learned, often looks like ease. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching Lucy practice lines for the school play, Elena said something that caught me off guard. "I used to think love meant enduring discomfort," she said. "Now I think it means refusing to make yourself smaller just to keep the peace." "That's wisdom," I replied. She smiled. "I learned it here." The foster agency asked me to mentor new foster parents that year. I agreed, though I warned them I wasn't professional, just someone who'd stayed long enough to make mistakes and learn from them. During one session, a young man asked, "How do you not take it personally when kids push you away?" I thought about that. "You don't not take it personally," I said. "You take it patiently." He nodded, writing it down like a formula. Evan reappeared only once more. It was at a community fundraiser for youth services. He was there as a volunteer, wearing a plain shirt, stacking chairs. We spotted each other across the room. He hesitated, then approached. "I didn't plan to see you," he said. "I rarely plan these things," I replied. He looked tired. "Honest, I wanted you to know. I finally understand why you didn't fight me with anger." I waited, because anger would have made me feel important, he continued. "And you didn't want that lesson to stick." I studied him. He wasn't wrong. "I'm not the man I was," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "You're not." That was all. He returned to stacking chairs. I returned to my seat. No reconciliation scene. No dramatic closure. Just acknowledgement. That was enough. The years rolled on. Lucy entered middle school, then high school. She argued passionately about science projects and stayed up late studying. On the night she received her acceptance letter to a competitive summer program, she ran through the house shouting, "I did it! I did it!" Elena cried. I laughed. The walls absorbed another memory. One afternoon, long after the house had quieted, I walked the hallway alone. I stopped at the wall of photographs. There were many more now. New faces. New futures. At the end of the row, Lucy's photo waited, recent, confident, unmistakably rooted. I thought back to that Tuesday morning years ago when a man had walked into this house, convinced he could rearrange lives like furniture, when he believed timelines and trucks and paperwork defined power. He had been wrong. Power isn't in possession. It's in presence. It's in staying when it's inconvenient, in choosing people over comfort, in building something that outlives threats. This house had outlasted arrogance, entitlement, and assumption, not because it fought back loudly, but because it stood, and it would keep standing. Because long after arguments fade and pride dissolves, what remains is what you are willing to protect without demanding anything in return. Before you go, do me a small favor. Support the channel. Share it with someone who needs a reminder what family truly is. And tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this travel farther when people carry them forward.